Okay, great. Well, so we decided while we were planning these lecture lives that kind of in between of going over particular artists that we would go over some major themes kind of in art history as a whole that relates both to, ancient, modern and contemporary art. And so we were kind of brainstorming and we thought about art and mythology and how important it is today. And we can even see that there are a lot of contemporary artists and contemporary authors in particular that still draw on a lot of mythology found in, Greek and Roman culture, but found especially like in, more Nordic cultures, even Chinese cultures. So we're seeing a lot, kind of almost a renaissance of an interest in mythology, I think, with some segments of contemporary art and literature. And so we thought that this would be a good time to kind of go over some of the basics, where do they get these ideas from? What's the importance of mythology? Why should we care? What happened to it? And why so many people kind of in the Renaissance and then, even modern art still incorporated these mythological figures knowing that they weren't real, right? Why did they incorporate it into their art later on? So that's kind of what I think we're going to do. And so I'm going to give you like the basics. Here's some of the four major mythologies that still play an important role even to our societies today, kind of what the Western and Eastern worlds have been built on. And then our next session will continue and it will go into later art, kind of beginning in, right around like early Renaissance onto contemporary, and how artists and even authors are still incorporating these elements into their work. But let's go into the basics. So I hope you guys enjoy. I've had a lot of fun researching. So now you can just consider me the mythological expert. Actually, no, don't do that. But I have had fun researching it. So before we kind of get started into, let me move this. There we go. Before we kind of get started into or get into mythological figures, let's just take a moment to consider what mythology really is. So mythology has provided the necessary inspiration and framework for many visual artists throughout history and today. And this series is about recognizing the special relationship between art and mythology, how they kind of influenced each other, why they were such a big deal, particularly the creative aspects behind each genre and how they work together. So like I said, this first lecture will examine mythological origins and the art they produced in ancient cultures, and the next series will examine their impact on historical and recent culture. But thing to remember is that each figure, story, myth, tale, and folklore, any sort of folklore, all convey important messages about cultural concerns at the time, right? And we can see that even in major religions playing out today. You've got major religions that are focused on whether it's purity, dignity, strength. They honestly usually reflect the culture at the time, much like the visual arts always reflect the current culture at the time. You just can't get away from the cultural impact. Now things are changing so fast just because of social media and constant global contact that it's a little more difficult to pin down. But just know that these mythological stories are not just, they're always representative of something deeper at the time. They really represent kind of what the culture was trying to build. So as we'll see, honor was embodied and represented in ancient Chinese culture, much like virtue was represented in Roman culture. Each culture holds both similarities and differences in their mythological origin stories, but all represent the fabric which really has shaped our modern world. So with that, we will continue. Now, before we get started right in Egypt, here's just a note that I didn't share in the PowerPoint. These mythological stories were considered legitimate religions at the time that they were being practiced. They were not considered legitimate religions, in later representations in art, but these were considered foundational histories for each culture, even with all of the supernatural elements. So just remember that. So first, we're going to start with Egypt. Now, Egypt is an interesting case. We don't just have a lot of just freestanding sculptures left. you know, we've got a lot of kind of like these relief sculptures that can be found on the inside the walls of pyramids and other certain structures. Now we do have some freestanding statues, but you got to remember most of them are damaged. But here we've got some of the major players in Egyptian art, and I kind of did this because Egyptian art is a little bit more difficult to tell like who's being represented, because they are made in such a consistent style over different dynasties. So over to the left, we have Isis, who we'll learn is the mother goddess in Egyptian mythology. And here we have Ramses, who is an important pharaoh. Ramses III presents an offering to Amun, and that was the, you know, god of all gods, which we'll get into. And this is actually a depiction of Amun-Ra, which was kind of a combination of two gods, but distinctly Amun. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. And I know that's confusing, but this is kind of the style that we're looking at. And it's important to remember that Egyptians kept this stylistic kind of flat quality that you see. And this was purposeful. It's not that they weren't talented. It's not that they didn't have artists that knew how to create models in 3D like the Greeks or the Romans, but this was a particular style that they wanted to keep, that they thought was representative of their culture. And we'll find out why. So ancient Egyptian civilization lasted more than 3,000 years, and their mythological and personal representations carried the cultural importance of stability. And the reason we're starting with Egypt is because they are such an old empire. So they were ruling far before Greece and Rome, but we know that they had interactions with Greece and Rome as well. So just understand that their civilization lasted more than 3,000 years, and that's done purposefully. And a big part of why they lasted so long is because they emphasize this understanding of cultural stability. So also the Nile River played a crucial role in Egyptian art, so much so that it really can't be overstated of its importance. The Nile itself represented life, renewal, and most importantly, stability, because they wouldn't have been able to survive in the desert, right, without the Nile. So ancient Egyptian culture shaped not only Western history, but the Western world as we know it. So a lot of our base cultural understandings actually were shaped from ancient Egyptian culture. And it's hard for us to get away from history, but because they were so impactful for the Greeks, who were impactful for the Romans, and Romans, who we also know that our American Republic is based on, it's very hard to get away from this cultural understanding that a lot of what we get and a lot of who we are is indebted to these older civilizations. So a very important aspect to consider is the importance of Egyptian rulers in Egyptian mythology. So as they were considered to straddle both the terrestrial and the divine realms. So they were both, you know, they were both divine and mundane at the same time. So in visual representations, rulers were often depicted forward, so at the forefront, while the spirit of the kings, Ka, was represented behind them as a separate entity. Pharaohs and kings were also associated with the powerful god Horus, who sought revenge for the murder of his father and is said to have put the first human ruler on the Egyptian throne. Major players in Egyptian mythology is Amun, so Amun-Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis, Mut, Ra, Thoth, Sekhmet, and Geb. And there are many others. Like the gods and goddesses of Hinduism, there are hundreds and potentially thousands of unrecorded or underrecorded Egyptian entities. Those mentioned above, however, are significant players in the visual arts, along with important members of royal families. So think King Tut, right? He's significant. He's a major player. So remember the concept of virtue. Remember the concept and virtue of stability, continuity, and rebirth are significant cultural concerns found in mythological representations of entities and individuals, particularly in ancient Egypt. So the first guy we're going to study is Amun. So he is king of all Egyptian gods and goddesses. He's the chief deity of the Egyptian empire and the most represented alongside Osiris. He's known as a powerful ruler, representing the continuity and powerful Egyptian culture. Historically considered, he's the champion of the people. Thus, he's very important to Egyptian personal piety. So he was important not only in the vast understanding of Egyptian lore, but he was very important in the daily lives of the Egyptians too. So he's largely identified with the cult god Ra and the sun god, who's the sun god. Thus, Amun or Amun-Ra is often depicted with solar characteristics, and Ra is simply another manifestation of Amun's power. Now, this happened over time. They were separate entities at one time, but eventually, over time, their identities began to emerge. And because Amun was considered the all-powerful deity, he eventually, took on Ra's characteristics. So a lot of when you see Ra, it's actually Amun Ra. And that actually happened with a lot of other gods and goddesses in this mythology. He became identified with them and really created a type of monotheism, as many religious participants considered other entities representations of Amun or different facets of Amun's power. So there was kind of this there was this kind of straddling both pantheism and monotheism at the same time with Amun. So he was very, very important. So when you think of Zeus and you think of Jupiter in Greek and Roman lore, think of Amun in Egyptian lore. So Osiris is the next major player, and so we can see him represented here. He's often represented with this cap, and just like Amun was often represented with blue skin, Osiris is usually represented with green skin, and it's because green was obviously the color of life, right? So green is the color usually of vegetation and renewal, rebirth, however you want to look at it, but he was associated with all of these things. And that really comes from his story too. So Osiris is the god of fertility, agriculture, the afterlife, the dead, resurrection, life, and vegetation, aka this boy is essential to Egyptian mythology and by extension, Egyptian thought. So just consider all that he represents. He represents fundamental life necessities such as food and drink, which all represent life. We even see that represented in Renaissance paintings and Baroque paintings. Fruit is represented, and these are life-giving things. He's representative of vegetation, and by extension, he's representative of the Nile itself. Fertility and the afterlife are representative of seasons that all must pass through. So it's no wonder Osiris is really represented a lot in visual culture, because he symbolizes the very survival elements of Egyptian culture itself, and how they sustained their life. Whereas Amun may represent power and stability, Osiris represents continuity and survival. So both of these gods, why they're so important, is because they also represent cultural concerns of the people at the time, because these people are not, they can't go down to the grocery store and just go to Walmart and pack a bag or whatever. They've got to survive somehow. The Nile is important, vegetation is important, farming, the continuity of life, which will bring us to our next deity, and that is Isis, who's considered the mother goddess. So she, let's see, let me move my, sorry. So she's considered the divine mother of all rulers. Isis is the goddess of motherhood, so she naturally falls into symbolizing certain aspects of fertility, of protection, of nurturing, and that falls a lot into her legend. Legend says that she helped resurrect Osiris, and she also assists those passing into the afterlife. And in this painting over here, she's actually represented on the far left, and she is helping she's helping a pharaoh, she's helping a ruler pass into the next life. So she will accompany him as well as with Anubis as well. Anubis was also a major player we're not going to learn about, but Anubis is, as we all know, he's pictured throughout history with the head of a dog, right? So she can be seen on the far left. This sculpture is also attributed to her, is also attributed to a representation of Isis as mother, but it's not been definitively identified as her, but a lot of scholars are led to believe that this was her. And this also gives us a kind of a picture into like some 3D sculpture that the Egyptians did do. A lot of them looked like this. A lot of them were maybe a little bit, mature looking. A lot of them might have been flatter, but this is an example of Egyptian sculpture that's pretty important. So her popularity even spread to ancient Greece, where she was a significant cult goddess. We're going to see this, and we're going to see this term cult god and cult goddess. It means that they were not necessarily a god and goddess that everybody worshiped, but they were usually important to that specific cult and that specific place at the time. And even though these cults would also worship, Zeus or Amun or somebody else, they would they were mainly about this god or goddess as well. So they always gave heed to where it's deserved, but cults also had a particular proclivity to worship a certain god for a certain reason because it was important at the time. So motherhood plays a significant role in continuing culture, as you can imagine. Mothers mothers birth entire generations, and they keep society going. Society can't go without people. So it was definitely good, and it was definitely not a burden to women, but it was definitely expected that all women would become mothers, and they would continue the line of continuity and Egyptian culture by extension. So it's natural that this goddess rose in popularity both in female life and the afterlife. So now we're going to jump over to Horus. So Horus was the son of Osiris and Isis. He's the god of kingship and the sky, and is usually depicted with the head of a falcon or a peregrine falcon. Now, him being the god of the sky, we understand why he's depicted as a falcon. Falcons are known as some of the most powerful and definitely the fastest birds in the world. They weren't much different in the ancient world. So just know that he was kind of considered Lord of the skies. So legend said Horus was born to seek vengeance over the murder of his father Osiris and was his heir to the Egyptian throne. Thus, much like Osiris, Horus is associated with life surrounding Egyptian kingship, as he represents the true heir and ultimate rival to Set, who is the brother and murderer of Osiris himself. So he represents this idea of the true ruler, which is why he's often associated with Egyptian pharaohs or Egyptian rulers as well, because he's considered the true ruler. Okay, he's the continuous dynasty that plays a part in the Egyptian pharaohs. So like Osiris, Horus also represents royal continuity, brings stability to the Egyptian kingdom. So it's not just always about power, although we know that in all politics throughout all culture, there's always power at its center. But with the Egyptians in particular, why they reigned for 300 years, why they were so powerful, is because they were focused on this aspect of continuity and stability. And they represented a lot of that in their visual arts, and that's what their deities were known for. Okay, their mythology centered around these cultural understandings and cultural importances, which is how they continued their kingdom for 3,000 years. And so that's what mythology does to these ancient cultures. It is representative of something that's important to them. So now we're going to move on to Greece, and I know that we're going to be going through a lot of this stuff kind of fast, and that's because I want to give you guys as much information, and so we'll have plenty of time. We should have time to talk about it and answer questions, but this is kind of a fun, history lesson, and you get to see some good art. So now we're going to go on to ancient Greece, and so here we have Hercules, or Heracles is the Grecian understanding of Hercules. We know him by Hercules because we're descendants kind of Latin. So this is the Laocoon with his sons, and these are the three Graces. So these are all major figures, mythological figures in Grecian art. We're going to learn a little bit more about Heracles, but the Laocoon and his sons, that comes from the ancient fall of Troy, if you'll remember. So he's mentioned both in the I think he's mentioned in the Iliad, and he's mentioned in the Aeneid as well. And so he's attacked by serpents, and him and his sons are killed. So that's a mythological story of the fall of Troy. And obviously we've got the three Graces, which represent certain embodiments of virtue, and play a major part as well in Greek lore. So some stuff to consider. Greek mythology is the absolute pinnacle of mythological history. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time here, and then we're going to kind of quickly go through Roman and Chinese mythology. The Greeks didn't center their mythology on deities alone, but on demigods, heroes, and mythological creatures. And mythological creatures played an important part in forming ancient Grecian culture. The reason Greek mythology is so popular is because of the sheer amount of stories and lore surrounding mythological events. So think about the two most famous stories in history, which are easily the Iliad and the Odyssey. Both narratives include mythological elements and origins about the world. Both include significant heroes with complicated backstories, such as Achilles and Odysseus. All of Grecian culture was centered around their mythology, which was at the time their pantheistic religion. Scholars today study these diverse mythologies, hoping to discover political and religious cultural trends, further gaining insight into this really an exceptionally creative culture, because they did create so much mythology surrounding kind of their supernatural history. And, you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey played a great deal in that, along with, you know, many poems and all of those things. So a subject to remember in Grecian legend is the concept of heroes, strength, and creativity. The arts were very important to the Greeks, which is perhaps why most of their visual arts and literature remains so influential to this day. The arts themselves took on their own identity, reflecting the culture around them, but also standing individually as important creations. Major players in Grecian lore, as we know, are Zeus, Athena, Aphrodite, Dionysus, Poseidon, Hercules, Achilles, and Odysseus. So kind of that's a lot, and we're studying, you know, understand that these are huge, major cultures throughout history that we're trying to study in very little time. So I know that you might have a lot of questions, but I think just know that Greek mythology by far has had most cultural impact on the Western world. You know, obviously Egyptian had its foundations there, and Greek built a lot of itself on, you know, Egyptian foundations, but because of so many stories and poems and so many artistic representations that the Greeks made of their deities, of their mythologies, we're still experiencing and get to experience all of that stuff, all of that today. So just know that they're very important, and I would argue probably the most important mythologically to the Western world as we know it. So the most popular deity in Grecian legend is, of course, Zeus himself, and he is the king of all gods and goddesses, ruling from Mount Olympus, fathering many deities along with demigods and ancient heroes. So he's very important. There are many representations of him in art, and we've got a few right here. So this is obviously a sculpture of Zeus, and he is most famously known wielding his weapon of a lightning bolt. And we can see that both in the sculptural representation and the representation on this vase as well. So the lineage of most Grecian entities are somehow related to Zeus himself, as he takes the ultimate title of father. Masculinity, as we know, was highly prized for the Greeks, which is seen in their lore. Masculinity represented strength, stability, honor, and freedom. Zeus himself represented all of these and more. He is known as the god of thunder, often, like I said, portrayed with lightning bolts as his weapon. He embodied many religious archetypes in Grecian culture, as he represented wisdom and the ultimate protection of the Grecian state. And being father of all, and much like Amun in Egyptian culture, Zeus is somehow associated with all Grecian mythology. Essentially, mythology is not the same without Zeus, and it wouldn't be today. So many legends have been told about him. All of Greek mythology is somehow related to Zeus himself, whether it's just something that he's commanded, a deity that he's fathered, a deity that he's created. We know that Athena, his daughter, popped out of his head, right? So he was not only, so that also kind of adds another layer of his identity for the Greeks, that he's almost the embodiment of creation himself. So he's a necessary part of Grecian mythology. He's known as the All-Father, and so even among like cults that I was telling you about, where they worship various deities, Zeus is always worshipped no matter what, whether by extension or overtly. So very important. We really wouldn't have Greek mythology without him. So kind of moving on to a Greek goddess, one of the most significant Greek goddesses in both the ancient world and modern history is Aphrodite. Associated with love, beauty, fertility, pleasure, and passion, she is understandably one of the most notable figures in mythology. Her femininity is important for a reason, providing balance to the heroic masculinity depicted in the mythological story. And we all know of the Venus de Milo as well, with the missing arms. A lot of what we know about particularly ancient beauty customs and standards are kind of gained from Aphrodite. So we know that in the ancient world, they like their women a little thicker. We know that in Renaissance, they also like their women a little thicker. And we know that because they were such a big fan of the ancient Aphrodite, or ancient Venus, as in Roman culture. Now, this is a Grecian sculpture. It's called Venus de Milo for other reasons, but just note this is a Grecian sculpture. But what's important is that she is kind of this pinnacle of love, beauty, and fertility and passion. And so she represents a lot of things, but she represents this balance to the very masculine culture of ancient Greece. So although Aphrodite was important to women, cultural expectations didn't really allow respectable women to give into their passions. So even though Aphrodite may be a female deity, plot twist, it's really more about the men, but more so she was an important inspiration for male love and passion rather than female, because she represented freedom, right? So she represented the important cultural concept in the ancient Greek world, which was also freedom and passion, and often freedom and passion created or gave birth to creativity itself. And that was a very masculine trait in the ancient Greek world. So as you can see, the Greeks were passionate people, especially in comparison to kind of the very strict Stoic Romans. Aphrodite could probably be correctly called the ultimate muse, as she still inspires a lot of artists, artisans, poets, authors today. So another significant cult god would be Dionysus, who was essentially the god of wine and libations, aka he was kind of a party hound, but he was associated largely in the ancient world with cultivation and fertility. So this is very important because he's got a lot of elements in relation to even Egyptian lore. So when you talk about Osiris, you're talking about he's the god of life, the god of vegetation. Well, Dionysus also takes some characteristics of Osiris as well. So it's important to remember that the Greeks valued freedom too, which is why Aphrodite and Dionysus were so significant, because he may have symbolized vegetation and life in that sense, and cultivation, but he also symbolized kind of the more negative aspects of, drinking and wine, and the freedom that they allow. Not necessarily negative aspects, but the freedom that happens when you're drinking a lot with your friends. Much like the Egyptians emphasized stability, the Greeks emphasized freedom. I can't really stress that enough because it was very important to them. But Dionysus also represented the importance of vegetation and the religious nature of wine being good for the soul. And because wine was so significant in the ancient world, and Dionysus was seen as the god who provided it, he was an important cult god to everyday people and religious rites. So he was very important to a lot of people in their personal worship, which is why he was such a big cult god in certain regions, particularly regions rich with wine and vineyards and all of that. So now we're going to go back to Hercules, he's an interesting figure because he's both man and god at the same time. So I think demigod would probably accurately portray him. Of course, you've got scholars that disagree, like, no, he's a god, no, he's a man, whatever. But for simplicity's sake, we'll call him a demigod. Hercules is one of the most important heroes in Grecian mythology. He's the most famous of heroes, a paragon of masculinity and a champion of Olympia, protecting them from monsters. So we know that in some of his battles, he battled, great lions, great monsters, the seas. And so that's kind of how he built his reputation. So he's very much the god of heroes, though, making him an important cultural figure to be praised for his strength, bravery, and overt masculinity. Much like his father Zeus, he also stands as a protector. But rather than a father, he's a dutiful son protecting Olympus and Greece itself. So his death also serves as a type of metamorphosis, as he joins the gods on Mount Olympus, according to some, after he dies. Therefore, he also stands as an important cultural construction of rebirth and heroic identity. So he's an interesting figure, and a lot of scholars have done some research on him and why he's so important. And so, like I said, because the Greeks loved heroes and they loved warriors and they loved masculinity, he obviously became kind of this embodiment of all masculinity. And you'll see a lot of warriors. I don't think it might have been Achilles that was stated that he was a descendant of Hercules himself. So you'll find a lot of notable warriors in Grecian mythology or history note or say that they were actually descendants from Hercules himself. because he was such a significant warrior and he represented a lot of different things. So, sorry, my light's leaving. It gets really dark in Alaska really fast, and so my light's leaving. So he's an important figure. He's actually a very important figure in Roman mythology, and I'll just go ahead and talk about that for a quick second. So the Romans adopted Hercules as their own and renamed him kind of the Latin Hercules, but they kind of adopted almost the same exact person, saying, no, this is a real person. He's just important to Rome. And they did that because they emphasized this idea of a very masculine warrior who was dutiful and obedient. And so he was also very important to Roman culture, which we'll find out that a lot of the Greek gods and goddesses in Greek mythology were very important to Roman culture as well. And that will segue us into Rome. So this is a really cool stele. They're called stele, but it's a relief sculpture of Romulus and Remus and kind of the founding of Rome. And so we actually see Romulus and Remus right here at the bottom. This we'll come to find out as we study them is kind of this idea of Rome itself with the Capitoline wolf. And so Roman mythology, although greatly inspired by the Greeks, did have its own set of morals, values, and ethics. In fact, Roman mythology, we see the importance of local deities and the foundation of Rome playing a larger part rather than only the gods themselves. The Roman state was far more important than any individual, and supernatural lore reflected this idea. Roman religion was also a bit of a modge-podge when put together, as many of their belief systems are reflected in ancient Etruscan culture. And so I put in parentheses Italian peninsula. The Etruscans were kind of the original inhabitants of the Italian peninsula. And so if you want to say like native Italians, maybe that's easier, but that's kind of who the Etruscans were. And they were an ancient and a very powerful culture as well. We just don't hear as much about them because they were subject to the Romans. So Roman mythology lacks the sheer number of divine narratives as found in Greek mythology, but it doesn't make their origins and myths any less popular. So thank Romulus and Remus, that's very important. And it's inspired a lot of, artists and poets and authors. As history continues, and because Latin was more popular in Europe, modern history remembers the names of Roman deities more so than their Greek counterparts, which is why we say Hercules, why we know who Jupiter is. He's, the idea of Zeus. Now, Zeus is very important, but, we think of Diana, who's the goddess of the hunt. Well, in Greek mythology, that was actually Artemis. We actually remember the Roman counterpart names of Greek heroes and Greek deities more so because we've been trained in Latin, and because a lot of Europe was trained in Latin. Obviously, that's where a lot of American education comes from. So just a brief history lesson. So even though we know more of like Greek stories, sometimes we remember the actual names of Roman stories or Roman individuals more so just because we've been taught that way. So either way, Roman mythology emphasizes a different set of concerns like politics, morality, and an individual's personal integrity in relation to the Roman state. So really, it's fundamental and crucial to remember it's about the state and it's not about the individual. So, and which is how the Roman Empire became so powerful so fast. So heroism is also a major theme, just like it was in Greek culture. So the Roman Hercules does pop up in many forms of literature and art. Now, we're not going to particularly study him, but just know that he's around. So Romulus and Remus are really who we're going to study because the Roman state itself is so important. We've got to study kind of the origins of it. And this is really a lot of origin stories kind of riffed off of this idea of Romulus and Remus as well. So Romulus and Remus are foundational figures in Roman mythology as they represent the birth of the state itself. So the two brothers were left to die by the Tiber River as infants, and they were taken care of by others, the most popular being the she-wolf. The boy suckling, the she-wolf, was the main representation of Roman history and the legend that has inspired many authors, poets, and artists. And we can actually see in this sculpture, which is this is just a piece of a larger sculpture called, I think it's called Crossing the Tiber River, or the Tiber. but we actually see the Capitoline wolf right here, and we actually see Romulus and Remus being taken care of by her. So their life and stories eventually led to the founding of Rome by Romulus. Therefore, the boys represent this idea of steadfastness and endurance, which are major themes within the Roman virtue system. Now, if there's anything that I can stress, is that the Romans had a virtue system that was very important to them. Ideas of decorum, ideas of piety, ideas of morality. They were very strict about it, more so than kind of this Greek emphasis on freedom. And that's how they really came to power so quickly, because they expected people to bow down to the larger ideas of the state rather than individual freedoms. So Romulus was also considered Rome's first king, attributing a type of patriarchal fatherhood to the city and culture. Masculinity also plays a great role in Roman culture, albeit different than masculine representations of the Greeks. So instead of just kind of this presence of a strong hero, Roman culture kind of views a different type of, kind of views masculinity a little bit differently, although they do emphasize the idea of a hero, and we'll see that, you know, in the Aeneid and studying Aeneas a little bit. They still are representing something different. It's more about virtue for them. It's more about obedience and duty for them, more so than it was the Greeks, who, you know, celebrated freedom and creativity. So it's a lot of people want to say the Romans rifted off the Greeks, and I suppose you can make some of they did adopt some of their deities, but really it was a completely different culture with completely different standards. So that's important to remember. Now, we are going to learn a little bit about Aeneas, which is, I know, probably a little bit different, you know, so we're not going to look at Juno or Jupiter or Diana or these figures that represent a lot of Greek and Roman, or a lot of Greek mythology, but we're looking at specific individuals that represent Roman mythology, and original Roman mythology. So Aeneas was son to Anchises and Venus, who is also known as Aphrodite, but Venus is her name in Roman mythology. So goddess of love, passion, fertility. So Aeneas is perhaps the greatest hero of all Roman mythology and history. So after the fall of Troy, he sailed the seas until eventually founding Rome. And they kind of cast the story that he was a descendant of Romulus and Remus himself. So there is some contention in scholars in history and mythology, like, you know, who came first? Did Aeneas come first, or did Romulus and Remus come first? When did they actually found Rome? That is a problem in their history, that they never really, that they just said, oh, well, he's a descendant of Romulus and Remus. So that's how they kind of justified it. But just know it's kind of confusing, but all mythology is a little bit confusing. So he became the first true hero of Rome, and he was kind of made, or he was talked about in competition with the Greek Achilles and Odysseus. Many scholars consider Aeneas as the embodiment of destiny, duty, and heroism. He, being the obedient son, rescued his father from the fires of Troy, never allowing him to give up, because his father just said, oh, let me die. And he said, nope, we're not going to do that. You're going to come with me, and we're going to found a society for the Trojans, for the future of Troy, which naturally became Rome. So he founded Rome against all odds and many calamities, earning the title of hero. But his character, virtue, and duty were above all else important to his story. He even left, in the story of the Aeneid, he even left his lover Dido, I think it's Dido, to search for his destiny, symbolically leaving passion and love behind in search of something greater. And this idea, above all, sets Romans apart from the Greeks, that he left something that was representative of his desire, of his passion, of his love, of his freedom, and of his masculinity. He left all that in search for something greater, which was the embodiment of virtue and duty and obedience, and a protection of his people. And so if there's any cultural strain that I can stress more in the difference between the Greeks and the Romans, it's that right there. And they knew in writing about Aeneas, he was going to be compared to Greek heroes of Achilles and Odysseus, but his weaknesses are not their weaknesses. His weaknesses more lie in wanting to give up, wanting to settle down per se, wanting to pursue what he wants, but eventually finding strength in continuing on his destiny. So this idea of destiny was very important to the Romans as well. So, and that really ends it's kind of an abrupt end to Roman mythology, but I think, I wanted to give you guys a good overview of kind of the difference between Greek and Roman. And since a lot of the mythological figures are the same, because the Romans obviously didn't make as many stories, they weren't necessarily as much of a creative people as the Greeks were. A lot of it is, kind of a rehashing of Greek mythology as well, albeit with a certain twist on specific Roman virtues. But before we end, I wanted to go over some Chinese mythology, because I think it's probably important that we understand that there are a lot of similarities and differences kind of in our Western world versus Eastern world. And it seemed unfair because Chinese mythology has influenced a lot of even our culture today, particularly cultures in the East. So thought it would be good to just go over it. Now, obviously I'm not an expert, but Chinese mythology holds more Eastern characteristics in its stories and lore, but still emphasizes essential cultural ideas to sustaining and continuing life. So they obviously have a different virtue system than a lot of kind of what our Western cultural histories have, but many are the same. Many of the stories really have more to do with local and regional deities rather than spiritual fathers such as Zeus, Amun, or Jupiter. Many important mythological characters often have animal-like characteristics to emphasize animals in general, like the dragon, toad, or the monkey. Although a different culture with different societal expectations, some fundamentals remain important, such as vegetation, honor, and fertility. All these traits can be seen somewhat in each culture we've studied. Different mythologies can also vary depending upon region and time period. So Chinese lore is a bit more difficult to pinpoint because it is so regional, and it is so unique to certain time periods. Although Chinese mythology has been linked to somewhat factual recording throughout history, it does emphasize magical powers and mythological places, even more so than Egyptian, Roman, or Greek lore. What was very important was the concept of Chinese folklore, which played a large part in Chinese religion, Chinese folk religion in particular. Like the others, Chinese mythology is intimately and perhaps even more so related to this idea of ritual. So we're going to learn a little bit. We're going to learn about kind of a mythological animal, and we're going to learn about a mythological being that's very important. And then after, we'll have some time to kind of talk about all that we've learned and the importance that you think it's going to play in, kind of future art. So dragons, also known as lung or long, are creatures that take many forms, but in particular, a snake form with scales and 4 legs. And we can kind of see that representation here, and this is on a porcelain plate, Chinese porcelain right here. This is largely the type of imagery that dragons took and were represented as, but they were also associated with strength, power, and good luck for those who are worthy. And so they were often associated with rulers. And so we can actually see the dragon represented on this depiction of an emperor at the very center. So emperors, it was very important for rulers to identify themselves with dragons. These beings symbolized potent and auspicious powers and are often associated with control over water, the sea, typhoons, and floods. And because their power was very unmatched and they were considered kind of the top dog of mythological creatures, obviously people that were very important, whether they were rulers or just, high society, they wanted to associate themselves with the dragon. The largest association throughout history has been the dragon symbolizing imperial power. And we probably know that even with, probably not modern China now, but, more recent Chinese history, dragons were still associated with imperial power. So much so that rulers claimed they were actually conceived somehow through the association or power of a dragon itself. In Chinese culture, dragons are often harbingers of good luck, holding much spiritual and cultural significance. So they're much different from the Western understanding of dragons as kind of fire-breathing monsters. And although a lot of our kind of contemporary authors are having a lot of fun in kind of rehashing, you know, what are dragons and what's their importance. In Chinese mythology, they were, in particular, they were symbolized of a good power, of benevolence as well. And so rulers who wanted to be powerful, obviously, but they wanted to care for their people, they wanted to be associated with dragons themselves. So they were very important. You can actually see it all over, you know, Chinese history, and you can actually go and visit, you know, the ancient imperial city, and you'll see a lot of dragon-like associations with imperial power and just the royal family and royal dynasties in general. So, and one more figure to really consider that's important to Chinese mythology is the fatherly figure of the Jade Emperor. And he's important to multiple religions, so he plays a role in multiple religions, often symbolizing purity, power, and light. His origins claim he was a type of heavenly prince, and even while young was intelligent, kind, and wise, so very benevolent and very powerful. He showed respect to all living creatures and eventually took the place of his father on the throne. After thousands of years, he attained golden immortality, and after even longer, he took the title of Jade Emperor. He's very important to Taoism, but also other religions such as Buddhism and even Korean mythology. And although he represents power by being on the immortal throne, he also stands for above ideas mentioned such as kindness, benevolence, and honor. And so these are particular virtues kind of found within the Chinese state and the Chinese region. Now, obviously, there were different cultures all around, and they were, you know, they were separated by regions, and so that's why it's so hard to pinpoint, you know, certain figures that were important to all Chinese regions and customs and cultures, because it was such a large place. But what's important to remember is that almost all of them respected the mythological creature of the dragon, and most all of them respected and worshiped this type of Jade Emperor. And you can see that because he's still actually found in a lot of modern day religions as well. So much like all other cultures, Chinese mythology emphasizes cultural expectations in its history, stories, and religion. Although there are some in Chinese culture, there are deities and there are entities that also represent, you know, vegetation and fertility. But just know that a lot of them are more regional and cultural deities rather than kind of, you know, the well-known, you know, Bacchus, who's just like Dionysus in the Greek religion or Greek mythology, or the closest thing we have to kind of a Zeus or a Amun-Ra or a Jupiter is this guy, you know, is the Jade Emperor, but it's different depending on the type of region and the type of time period in Chinese history that you kind of go into. So just know that Chinese mythology is a little bit harder to pinpoint, and it has a lot more to do with kind of like regional culture rather than, you know, culture as a whole. But there are some figures and mythological creatures that do make their way into all areas of Chinese life and history. So anyway, now that we've kind of gotten through that, and I can take a quick breath because I wanted to make sure that you guys all found and enjoyed it, we can kind of go over anything that you want. If you have any questions for me or Delana, you can feel free to ask those. But I hope you enjoyed kind of this first segment, and the next one will be exciting because we'll look at different pieces of art that these gods and goddesses and mythological creatures are still impacting to this day and impacted, you know, 500 years ago. Why are these things important? And we're going to kind of find out why they're still important to certain cultures and even to our culture today. So, but I wanted to give you the basics of where mythology came from, and because they were such a significant part of these cultures, they obviously made their way into their visual arts as well, and into their theater production, into their literature. And so these were the foundations of these cultures themselves, which is why they were depicted in all of their artwork. Hey, Delana, I think you're muted. No.
No, I was talking to my husband. I asked him to put the TV down for just a second, because I was about to go and I was about to unmute myself.
Oh.
So Diane said she's very thankful that we are doing this and that she hasn't studied in a while, and so she really likes it. So.
Oh, good.
Yeah. She's on all of the lecture lives, so she's like a super supporter.
Oh, I like her already.
Absolutely. So does anybody else have any questions, or does anybody have any questions? All right, so if not, then so this is going to be December 17th when we have our next lecture live. We have 2 other lectures in front of that. The first is Susanna Schreck-Heis, who is in our Gallery 2 at the museum, and she's doing the Attention to Tension. She was our 2019 invitational winner. And so she has some really cool pieces. So she's going to do a lecture over that. And then December 20th, or not 20th, December 10th, Grayson Danzig, who is the son of Jerry Danzig, who is the one that took the pictures of the Billie Holiday exhibition that we have currently going on. He's going to give an interview lecture and just kind of tell about the intimate things that he knows about Billie Holiday. So those are available, obviously free. And if you're interested, then sign up for them or just show up. It's all good either way. And then we'll be back with Samantha on December 17th for the part 2 of this lecture.
Great. Well, thank you all for attending.
Yeah. We'll see you in a couple days, hopefully.
Yeah, hopefully. We'll see.
Yeah. All right. Have fun. Bye.
Bye.